This is the second of our presidential lectures in neuroscience, which is a scheme that Bob Brown contributed to the beginning of the new neuroscience initiative here at Boston University. The effort, of course, was to bring together the strengths in neuroscience from both campuses. So we held the first of these lectures a month or so ago at the Charles River campus, and now we're holding the second of them on this campus. In many ways, there's what the Neuroscience Initiative represents is a fusion, an attempt to make much out of our ability to bring together neuroscientists who work on basic neuroscience research with those who work on clinical and translational research. By having both lectures at both places, hopefully that'll bring the communities together and force those kinds of wonderful interactions that things can pop out of. And this is a particularly special opportunity to do so because I think we have speaking to us today a neuroscientist who best exemplifies this combination of basic neuroscience and translational neuroscience that is going to be the future for neuroscience, I think, and a huge opportunity for Boston University to take advantage of as this century of neuroscience goes forward. So Tom Insel, who's going to be speaking to us today, is the director of the National Institute of Mental Health. And as I say, I'll just make a few points as points of introduction to try to bring home the notion that he is the perfect exemplar of this combination of excellence in both basic research and in progress in translational research. For starters, he got a good start. He got his BA combined with his MD here at Boston University, and that obviously is a great beginning for terrific things. After finishing his residency, he pursued clinical research, including a long stint at National Institute of Mental Health before he branched off to Emory University, where he held several positions of leadership in both basic and translational research. So he was the head of their NSF Center for Behavioral Neuroscience, and at the same time was the head of a Center for Autism Research. And at the same time, the director of the Yerkes Primate Center. So that's obviously demonstrating his leadership capacity in several domains which often run separately, but he made them make sense together. Moving off of that, he was then recruited to take over the directorship at NIMH at a particularly crucial time. I think of it as an especially crucial time because we've made so many discoveries in basic neuroscience, and the basic neuroscience of disorders in particular over the last several years, and we have yet to kind of bring them really into the community, to make translation really translate into its usefulness, into the promise for NIMH that we offer to this country. And Tom is in the position now to really spearhead that movement, to bring together basic and translational research and make the promise of NIMH be the promise of America into this next decade as we move along. So I'm really excited to hear what his directions are for today, and welcome, Tom.
Whoops, let's see. It's a good topic. But Great. Well, thank you very much, Howard, for that introduction. It's a real pleasure to be here. A little bit of nostalgia. As Howard mentioned, I went to college and medical school here, although it doesn't look anything like it did in the time when I was a student. I was thinking about this a little bit on the way up here, reading the New York Times this morning. There's a very funny article about a reunion of the class of '68 at Columbia, the group that took over the administration buildings. And there's a wonderful picture of all of these men and women together over the weekend. It looks a little bit like an AARP convention. So it's kind of striking to realize how many years have gone by. But what might have not been obvious from Howard's introduction was that I was not a particularly good student in either the undergraduate or the medical school part of my 7 years here. I was certainly very involved in the political activities of the late 60s and early 70s, and that was a time, for those of you who are students now, it's very hard maybe to understand just how chaotic, but also how exciting it was. There's just so many memories of time, of things that we did that were, I guess, blatantly illegal, but mostly to try to protest what we thought was an unjust war, and to, at that time, in the late 60s, really focus the nation's attention both on issues of civil rights and social injustice. And that's not totally irrelevant to what I want to talk about today, because what I'm going to focus on is the plight of those with mental illness. And though I probably won't have much time to go into this, I want to at least imply to you that in this decade, the problems of civil rights and social injustice, most of all, can be seen in the way that those people who have these illnesses are kept so much out of the mainstream of this society. They don't have the same kind of insurance coverage. They don't have the same access to health care. In fact, we have something called behavioral health, which is available to those with mental illness, which doesn't even fall into the same healthcare system as those with medical illnesses. They tend to be at the very bottom rung of this society, and they don't have really much of an opportunity to have a voice to change that, partly because they are so sick and so disabled. What makes this so different from the situation we faced 35 years ago or 40 years ago when we were in the midst of so much turmoil is that this particular problem of social injustice and civil rights will actually not be solved so much through political activity or taking over university buildings or being involved in illegal activities. It's going to be solved through science. And it's an extraordinary opportunity now to be able to use science for something that really will make the world a better place for those people who are most need that. So what I'll talk about in so many words is the way in which we can begin to translate this revolution in neuroscience that Howard was mentioning, this time where we've got so much to work with, to really making a difference for people who need those kinds of discoveries. We'll start, though, by backing up a little bit and talking about where healthcare is and where we are in general medicine in terms of translation. And I want to focus initially on three what I'll call disruptive innovations in medicine, which some of you who are here at the medical school probably are much more aware of, but it's something that's so, in some ways, so much a part of our culture we maybe haven't recognized how big the shift is. The first is that in the sense that the 20th century was the era of, or the century of infectious disease and acute disease, which has a particular model to it that involved rapid interventions, very brief clinical trials. We're now into an era of chronic diseases, obesity, diabetes, hypertension, coronary artery disease, and mental illness, all chronic illnesses that require a very different kind of research base, a different way of doing studies, which go over time, and a way of changing the way we think about the kinds of clinical trials and research that's needed. The last several decades, we've been focused on what some people pejoratively call average medicine. So 50 people on treatment A, 50 people on treatment B. You look for the mean differences in those two groups and you decide whether A is better than B. What that doesn't tell you is who responds better to A and who responds better to B. And most patients, when they go to a doctor, aren't really looking for information that says that 35% of people will be 40% better on this treatment. What they want to know is, hey, what's going to help me or what's going to help my child? What's the best treatment for the problem that I'm facing? You don't get that answer so much with average medicine, but you can begin to get it with what we're now calling personalized medicine, which is a different kind of trial that begins to focus in on individual responses, really focuses on individual differences, with the hope that we can ultimately tailor interventions for individual needs. And finally, we've sort of gone through a period of thinking about genetics as it applies mostly to those relatively rare Mendelian diseases. And there are many of them, but they're not all that common. The generation we're in now is really looking much more often at common diseases which are the result of many, many different risk factors, and we'll say more about that in a moment. Now, the good news about these kinds and other kinds of disruptive innovations in general medicine is that there's been just enormous progress. And you can see that just in this one graph borrowed from the Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute that shows what research has done in terms of just mortality from cardiovascular disease, about nearly a 2/3 reduction in deaths, which means that there have been about 1 million deaths averted in the past year, due to both interventions that are preventive or preemptive, as well as to treatments that now exist that we didn't have before. So that's just an extraordinary success story, and it's not unique. There are about 10 million people this past year surviving with cancer. In fact, in many ways, many forms of cancer are now thought of as chronic diseases. About a 60% reduction in mortality from acute stroke in places where the clotbusters are available. So you've got really some spectacular successes in terms of morbidity and mortality, which we can point to in medicine. Where are we, though, in the case of mental illnesses? Well, that looks unhappily very different. Here, we're really left to diagnosing the way we have for the last 5 decades, which is by observation, often at a very late stage in the disorder. We don't do well to be able to capture early stages of any of these illnesses. We don't know much about the causes of any of these illnesses. Prevention here is largely what I'll call global or population-based, rather than having a kind of individual tailored approach to it. And treatment is almost entirely by trial and error, where we actually don't have anything that looks like a cure. We don't even think about vaccines, except perhaps for Alzheimer's disease. But for the most part, for schizophrenia, bipolar illness, ADHD, anorexia nervosa, for the mood and anxiety disorders, we're not thinking in the way that we now think in the rest of medicine in terms of what we can do to both prevent and to cure these kinds of illnesses. The bottom line is that if almost across the board, let's see if I can remove this little thing at the bottom, if you don't need that. There. Prevalence really hasn't decreased for any of the illnesses that we think of as mental disorders, as far as I know. And mortality hasn't decreased in the way that we have seen for heart disease and for certain forms of cancer. This is a quick look from the World Health Organization Burden of Disease Study, just to give you a picture of what this looks like. And you can see that if you look at the dailies, these are disability-adjusted life years for a whole range of medical causes of disability. That unipolar depression, drug use, bipolar disorder, schizophrenia score very, very high here. You might be surprised by this because you'd think, well, what about cancer? What about heart disease? What about obesity, diabetes? What about all the things that we know are the big killers? Well, this is not about causes of mortality. This is about causes of disability. And this is largely focused on these years, 15 to 44 in Western Europe and in the US and Canada. And one of the reasons, actually, that you might ask, why do they choose that age range? Well, the WHO, in its infinite wisdom, defines that as the years of peak productivity, which for some of us who realize that a NIH research grant, usually the first grant is at age 42, this graph really has to give us some pause. But in any case, we'll assume that this is really the peak period. And what you can see is that these are disorders of young people. They're chronic and they're disabling. And it's really actually often not recognized that relative to these much more obvious sources of medical illness like cancer and heart disease, the mental disorders are actually responsible for far more disability, particularly for people under 45. Generally, the way to think about this is that these are highly prevalent. About 6% of the population will have what we call a severe mental disorder, meaning at some point they will be disabled by it. They are highly disabling, and this is the largest group of people who are on welfare, on SSI and SSDI, at a cost of about $25 billion in 2006 or 2007. And as I just mentioned, what separates these disorders from many, many other chronic disorders is that they begin very early. In the large population-based survey that was just completed, the NCSR, published a couple of years ago, 50% of those with mood and anxiety disorders described onset by age 14. and 75% by age 24. So in a sense, these really are, in the United States, the chronic disorders of young people. And what's so striking is that they're so disabling and that they cause so much in the way of taking people out of the productive workforce throughout life. It's not just a problem of morbidity, it's also a problem of mortality. There are about 30,000 suicides each year. Most people need some way to put that in context. So just to give you a sense, that's almost twice the number of homicides. You probably wouldn't think that from reading the morning paper or watching the evening news, but suicide actually is almost twice as common. It was actually 32,000 in 2007. So it's almost twice as common as homicide as a cause of death, far more common than deaths from AIDS, and all but colon, breast, and lung cancer, the three forms of cancer that have a higher mortality than suicide. So this is really kind of striking, and to me, remarkable that it's not better known. There's a couple of weeks ago, April 16th was the unhappy anniversary of the shooting at Virginia Tech when one very ill young man killed 33 other students and faculty before shooting himself. And in reading the coverage, both at the time that occurred as well as all the coverage at the time of the anniversary, what was so, to me, conspicuously absent was that no one remarked on the fact that every week since that episode, there have been on average 32 suicides amongst people in that age range, that there were 1,700 suicides in college age and high school age students over the past year. And yet we don't seem to be sensitized to this, or we seem to have just allowed this to go on without any recognition that much of this is indeed preventable. So what we need, from my perspective, are the same kinds of disruptive innovations that we've had in medicine and the rest of medicine. So I mentioned impacts that we've seen for cardiovascular disease and for cancer. And what I'd like to suggest in the next half hour is that we have a bit of those as well. I think we already have some of this for the way we think about mental illness, but we haven't yet quite put it in play. So the task now will be to translate it. So what I'd like to do is to walk through 4 of what I would call the most important discoveries or changes in the paradigm and the way we think about these. First of all, it's the recognition that these can be addressed as brain disorders, something that most of us now take for granted, but it's still mystifying to the public, and it's actually mystifying to many psychiatrists who have very little background in neuroscience or in studying the brain. One of the things that we have to face over the next few years is how you rebuild a workforce, because I've been trying to find good examples of when this has happened in medicine. There are not very many, but when you have an entire population of professionals for one particular discipline in which the fundamental basic science has shifted away, in this case, away from metapsychology, psychoanalytic theory, psychology, to neuroscience, and recognizing that of the 37,000 psychiatrists in the United States, only a handful know really anything about the brain, how it develops, or how it functions. So this will be quite a challenge, and it really comes out of this sort of decade of the brain in which we began to realize that the 300 years of separating mind and brain could now be collapsed, and we could begin to understand mental experience in terms of neural activity. The concept here is that we can understand mental disorders in terms of abnormal brain function, and that is still, for many people, counterintuitive and difficult to accept because it doesn't match our perception of ourselves or of our own minds, which in some funny, magical way, the brain keeps us from being able to understand how that mental activity could simply be neurologically based, and yet it continues. These are also very much developmental disorders, something that in some ways separates them from many more traditional neurological illnesses. So if you think about neurological illnesses as the dementias, neurodegenerative illnesses often occurring later in life, mental disorders, as I mentioned before, very early onset. Symptoms may not come on until adolescence or sometime thereafter, but we have every reason to think that the changes here are in circuits and in the way the circuits get laid down. And that may be actually the way to think about the difference between psychiatry and neurology going forward, where neurology is dealing with focal brain lesions, psychiatry is dealing with changes in brain circuitry and function. It's a little bit as if we divided up cardiology between ischemic necrotic disease, such as from coronary artery disease, versus conduction defects, which affect the function of the heart but may not have a focal lesion that you'd be able to cite. The third is the idea that these are complex genetic disorders, maybe in that sense not so different from most other medical illnesses. In this case, as with other illnesses, it's a very complex and still poorly understood combination of both genetic and experiential events. And the fourth, which is a somewhat different and maybe more sobering realization, is that we have lots of very useful treatments currently, but they are probably not sufficient for where we need to go, especially if we're going to talk about prevention and cure, because they simply don't do that for the vast majority of people. So what I'd like to do is kind of march through these one by one and give you a sense, just a few examples of why I feel these are disruptive and what I think some of the evidence would be for each of them. Let's start on the piece on brain disorders. This is a paper that just came out in about 6 months ago, but it's a great example, one of many. It's a study that was done, a longitudinal imaging study, looking at brain development in a group of a couple hundred children, and about half of them had ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and that's shown up here. That's the group from age 7 to age 12. These are typically developing controls who are very carefully matched and studied on the same scanner at the same time. This is the same set, but looking at it from a different perspective, so the same brains. But what you can begin to see is there aren't very many differences here, and there aren't very many differences here. But in fact, the brains of kids with ADHD are about 3 years behind in the way they're developing. You can see that in this right shift over on this side. It's all through the brain, but it's most pronounced in prefrontal regions, where the brain of an 11-year-old with ADHD looks almost precisely like the brain of an 8-year-old without. The point being that here's a disorder that we define by cognition and behavior, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which is in fact a disease of cortical maturation. We simply didn't know that before. We haven't been able to focus on what was different in the brains of kids with this disorder. But it is manifest with cognitive and behavioral changes that are treatable, but in fact the underlying pathophysiology is all about the rate at which the cortex matures. And we don't know why there's the delay. There's a lot of interest in understanding that. There's also a lot of interest in trying to figure out whether the medications that we use will actually have any impact on this 3-year delay. But this shifts entirely the way we think about the disorder and the way we can begin to approach it from a pathophysiological perspective. Same with depression, where we've recognized actually almost for a decade that there's this one area which goes by the affectionate name of Area 25. This was Brodmann's original designation in 1909. And he was about the last person to say anything about this area of the brain because no one thought there was anything interesting to study there until we had neuroimaging in people with depression and without, and we began to realize that there was something very interesting going on here. This initial study suggested that there was a reduction in brain volume, particularly perhaps in the loss of glia in this one particular brain area. Additional studies that have been done since then, looking at functional consequences of this, suggest that this same area, and this is now a lateral view, or you can take the frontal view, this subgenual area, a midline part of the brain in the cingulate cortex, seems to be hyperactive in people who are depressed, and it seems to become the place in the brain that responds when they get better. And interestingly, if you look at people who are treated with fluoxetine, which is the generic name for Prozac, which is a pretty good antidepressant, you'll find that in those people who respond, it's this area 25 that consistently reduces its activity, whereas in those who get the same medication but fail to respond, there's no change in that area. Whole range of reasons to think that this may be important. It's not just with medication, but with cognitive behavior therapy, with ECT, with virtually any treatment that relieves depression. One of the things that you consistently find is a decrease in activity of this one particular brain area. An absolute frontier in the brain, because up until about 2001, I don't think there were 4 or 5 papers in the literature that were focused on this. One of the reasons it has no name associated with it except Brodmann's original designation is because up until then we didn't know there was anything worth studying in this region. So we're just now beginning to understand the connections of this area, a lot more about its physiology, something about its molecular neuroanatomy. It turns out to be the part of the brain that has the highest concentration of serotonin transporter, so it's a target for the SSRIs, and it's an interesting area for further study. But my point here is that this kind of an observation, which comes in this case from a clinical research perspective, is giving us a whole new map of the way that we think about depression. And it allows us to begin to map out, and this is work from Helen Mayberg, who's done so much of the recent neuroimaging, excuse me, in this area, be able to map out the different aspects of depression and how they map on to different parts of different kinds of brain circuitry. This is very much, I think, where we're going in terms of thinking about an illness as complicated as depression. Again, yes, it's cognition, it's behavior, but the key here will be understanding its underlying neurobiology at the level of circuits and the way that circuits aren't functioning. It's also going to have a lot to do with understanding how those circuits develop. And so I'm going to say a little bit about these as developmental disorders. For many of us at NIMH, the kind of critical insight of this came from this study that was published just about a year ago. Actually from the same project that was looking at the longitudinal maturation of the cortex in healthy kids as well as in those with ADHD. This was a long-term project, about a 10-year project looking at children from 15 to 25 that Jay Geed and Judy Rappaport and their collaborators in our intramural program had pioneered. At the end of this, they were sitting around thinking about what to do with this huge data set, and somebody said, you know, it'd be interesting to look at whether any of those kids in that project had the ApoE4 allele for the risk gene for Alzheimer's disease. If you're homozygous for this particular allele, you have a 15-fold increased risk for developing Alzheimer's by the time you're 60. And they thought this might actually be possible to study in this group of normal children who are the controls for the ADHD study. And they went back, and sure enough, they had a group of kids shown on the right here who were homozygous, some who were heterozygous for ApoE4, and then those who were homozygous for ApoE2 or 3, who do not have the risk for Alzheimer's. And what's striking is in this case, even as adolescents, you can begin to pull them apart in terms of one area, in terms of the entorhinal cortex, and what you can see at that very early age, now 30 to 40 years before you're going to pick up any symptoms, you can begin to see changes in the brain that will tell you something about who may be at risk for this illness. The question is whether this will also play out for other diseases like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder and some of the anxiety disorders like OCD. And we have increasing reason to think that may be the case. So the first way of thinking about this is recognizing that if you look at people who have a psychotic break when they're between 18 and 24, which is when most people with schizophrenia have their first psychotic episode and when they finally get diagnosed, you realize that many of them have been not doing well for somewhere between 2 and 5 years. We've now come to call that the prodrome. We have actually a similar kind of expression for type 1 diabetes, which has actually very much the same sort of picture, where we've, up until recently, waited until kids become hyperglycemic and show insulin collapse before we make a diagnosis of type 1 diabetes. In the case of schizophrenia, when I was a medical student and a resident, we actually defined schizophrenia by the presence of psychosis. But of course, that's the end stage of this illness. Maybe not the end stage, but it's a late stage. What we really want to do is to be able to identify it much earlier. And the prodrome can be identified with about somewhere close to 80% predictability with these 5 factors, which, based on a study in 15 and 16-year-olds. Now, there are a lot of 15 and 16-year-olds who have unusual thought content. There's no question about that. And many who may show social impairment. But when you find those together with a family history and with a history of substance abuse, which is probably the most common of all of the 5 up here, you can, with some assurance, know that you're looking at someone who's indeed at a very high risk for schizophrenia in the subsequent 2 to 3 years, or at least for psychosis in the subsequent 2 to 3 years. And the point actually is that they probably already have schizophrenia, but we need to be thinking about this as a developmental disorder which has many stages to it, in which the psychosis is a later stage. With the ability to identify the prodrome and to identify those who are at high risk, we've been trying to increase the odds from 68 to 80% up into the 90% by looking at brain imaging and trying to identify changes in the brain, since after all this is a brain disorder, that would help you to say who really is at the highest risk, who's already beginning to take that trajectory towards psychosis versus who is just having a rather odd adolescence and will go on to be a very successful student at BU or someplace related in Boston. And what you can see is that by following these students, these kids from 15 to age 18 and 20, you can begin to tease apart areas of the brain that do show predictable differences, at least as group effects, and help you to recognize, again, by adding in brain imaging in the way that we would for cardiovascular disease, for instance, who may really be the person that you want to follow most closely. The point being now that we actually have a quite different model for how we think about a disorder like schizophrenia. And the developmental model looks something like this, that over the last couple of decades, we focused very much on the later stages, the presence of psychosis, the acute disability, and maybe what this looks like as a chronic illness. What I'm suggesting is that now we're at a point where we can begin to identify the illness before you get to the psychosis phase, where you might actually have the greatest opportunity to intervene, just like we would for coronary artery disease. We wouldn't wait for a myocardial infarction. We'd try to pick this up at a pre-anginal stage and then begin to use statins and exercise and diet to make sure someone doesn't actually have the myocardial infarction. Well, that's pretty much where we'd like to be with schizophrenia. And ultimately, of course, we'd even like to get there even earlier before you even get to the prodrome and pick this up at a time before someone even develops the very earliest symptoms, when you recognize this based on genetic risk factors and cognitive changes that may be a mark of creativity as well as a mark of being subject to psychosis. So that's a different picture of how we are beginning to think about these kinds of illnesses. Say something about genetics, because I think this is the other place that's undergoing such a huge revolution in both medicine as well as in psychiatry as well. This past year, 2007, was sometimes called, is now being called the Anno Mirabilis, the sort of miracle year for genomics. And it's largely because of the discoveries of so many human variations. This was the breakthrough of the year for Science Magazine. And I think you'll see in a moment why one would consider that. We had the Human Genome Project now 5-6 years ago, laying out the kind of map of human DNA. Interesting if you want to know how humans are different from mice. Not so helpful if you want to know what makes one person develop schizophrenia and the next person not. That depends on having a map of human variation, understanding individual variation. And we got more of that with the Human HapMap Project, which was a survey of the world's populations to come up with the most common variations in amongst the 3 billion letters in the text of human DNA. And there are a lot of them. There are about 3 million points of common variation. Some people would say even 10 million. So about 0.1% of DNA varies between any two of us. which we didn't actually realize so much in 2003 when we were celebrating the consensus human genome that was discovered and mapped at that point. But understanding human variation is really going to be the critical piece for understanding vulnerability to disease. And that has become even more complicated over the last few months as we've begun to realize that the variation isn't simply based on having these individual points, these what we call single nucleotide polymorphisms, these SNPs that vary between the consensus sequence and any individual sequence. You can see a couple here. But that there are other kinds of variations that we hadn't appreciated as much up until this past year, in which whole sections of the genome can get duplicated. Sometimes 100,000 or 200,000 bases at a time get duplicated, triplicated, quadruplicated, or sometimes get deleted. We didn't recognize how common that is, and we didn't recognize how spatially distributed that is in the genome, but that's now introduced a whole new kind of variation that we need to begin to study. The point of this is that it's more complicated than we thought 5 years ago, but we also have much, much more effective tools for doing this faster, better, and cheaper than we would have ever imagined 4 or 5 years ago. In fact, than we would have imagined even 2 or 3 years ago. And this has led to what is truly, I think, a transformational period for understanding the genetic basis of human disease. You can see that if you look at just the publications of discoveries of single base changes that are associated with disease, the so-called genome-wide association findings. The first one at the end of 2005 was this finding in age-related macular degeneration, which was kind of amazing because it was a complement factor associated with the most common cause of adult onset blindness. Amazing because we didn't actually think of this as an immune disease. We thought about it as a degenerative disease and didn't realize that complement would be involved. In fact, within a couple of months after this, there were a few other findings that suggested a second complement factor, and the two of them together explain about 60 to 70% of the risk for this form of blindness. So genetics really can begin to change the way you think about certain kinds of illnesses. By 2007, though, things began to really get interesting. In the first quarter, we began to have lots of these common variations that were showing up as risk factors for Crohn's disease, for ALS, for type 2 diabetes by March of 2007. By the summer of 2007, it really begins to take off, and you see now a whole range of both forms of cancer as well as neurodegenerative diseases, as well as more common SNPs that show up for Crohn's as well as for macular degeneration. The third quarter, it keeps going, fourth quarter, and even into 2008. I still need to update this slide for the last couple of months. But we have about 150 new discoveries over the last 18 months that begin to explain the risk for a whole range of common medical disorders. In some cases, as I just mentioned, for macular degeneration, really transforming the way we think about these illnesses. It's also happening for diabetes, for type 1 diabetes, where it turns out there's a huge overlap with the risk factors for celiac disease. Type 2 diabetes, which we always thought of as a problem with insulin resistance, 16 common SNPs that are associated, 13 of them actually have to do with insulin secretion and synthesis. Who knew? So this is really altering the way we think about so many of these disorders. The question, of course, for us is, will it do this for these mental disorders? And it hasn't happened yet. We're hopeful that it will over the next few months. There are lots of these whole genome association studies underway. We're beginning to get the first results of some of those, so the ADHD and bipolar results are just coming out. All of this, of course, is in the public domain. It involves thousands of patients being compared to thousands of controls. This is very much the middle of the story for the mental illnesses. But it's quite likely that when the story is finally told over the next 2 or 3 years, we'll have a list of, like we do in diabetes, 15, 20, 30 genes that may be really important for conferring risk. Why is that important? Well, it's probably useful to kind of manage expectations about this. I don't think this is going to give us a diagnostic test because these are, after all, risk factors. They're not the cause in the sense of a Mendelian mutation that leads to a particular disease outcome. I don't think they're going to do very much in terms of developing a kind of treatment. Certainly, we're not going to have gene therapies for 30 common SNPs that confer, each of which confers about a 3 or 4% increase in risk. So it's not like these are necessarily going to be the targets for developing immediate treatments. But what they will do, and which will be incredibly important, was they'll begin to give us a kind of on-ramp to the pathophysiology of these illnesses. We have not had a good, solid foundation in the molecular basis of any of these disorders. We've been, in some ways, fooled by having medications that looked effective. So we've basically been trying to use neuropharmacology to find our way to the pathophysiology of these illnesses, as if schizophrenia was an absence of thorazine or depression was just having too little fluoxetine in your system. What we really need to do is to back off from that approach and to begin to understand what is really the fundamental pathophysiology here, and genetics will help us. It will help to suggest many of the targets that we can begin to use as a way in to understanding these disorders. It'll get us some of the mechanisms of disease. So I think this is where much of the science will go. In a way, when we talk about translation, generally the classic model of translation is going from bench to bedside. I'd want to suggest to you that here we have the chance to go really from bedside back to the bench, that there'll be a whole decade now of 30 or 40 or 50 very interesting new candidates that will need to be studied in terms of brain development, in terms of brain function. And the way this will look is something like this. We'll have these common alleles that will show up. And what we'll find, and we're already beginning to see this, is that they will map on in ways that we had not suspected to the functions of particular brain circuits. It may not map that well to schizophrenia or depression or bipolar disorder, but it's likely that because of the way they affect specific circuits, they'll begin to affect cognitive and behavioral functions like reward pathways and working memory that will put people at risk for these disorders. This is very much the kind of model that we think about now in going from genes to cells to circuits to behavioral systems. So I'll finish up by saying a little bit about where we are with treatments, because that maybe is the most sobering part of this, and it's one that I think we really have to take a close look at, because we have been, for the last decade, I'd say, celebrating all of the breakthroughs that psychiatry has made in terms of therapies. And we decided to take a very close look at this at NIMH by investing in large-scale trials that were different from the kinds of trials the pharmaceutical industry had supported. So we took 10,000 patients around at 200 sites across the country with one of these three illnesses: schizophrenia, major depressive disorder, or bipolar illness. And we did what we called practical trials. So these were not drug versus placebo, they were drug versus drug, often multiple drugs. These were not done in academic health center clinics with patients who were professional volunteers. These were done in primary care settings where many people get their care. They were done often in community mental health settings. We weren't looking for a 15% reduction on a rating scale. We were looking for who gets better and who gets well. So we were looking at functional outcomes. We weren't looking at changes in 4 to 6 weeks because these are chronic illnesses. We were looking at changes over 12 to 18 months. Very different from the trials that are done for the FDA licensing efforts, or in general, trials that are done for marketing from a pharmaceutical perspective. And the results were very different as well. In fact, in the case of schizophrenia, about 74%, about 3/4 of the patients stopped whatever medication they were on. It didn't matter whether it was a second generation or first generation antipsychotic. They were about equally discouraging in a sense, or unsatisfactory. In depression, where we like to think we have really good treatments, we do, but only for a small fraction of the people who are being treated. About 31% showed full remission after 14 weeks, and about 2/3 at 1 year. But that still left a third who were not responding to a whole range of medications, and sometimes with the addition of cognitive behavior therapy, which we know is quite effective, but is not available to most people with depression. Bipolar illness, 21% were stable for 8 weeks at any time in the first 6 months. So again, we've got a long way to go for this disorder. And then just to one additional sobering note, we didn't have childhood illnesses in this particular set of trials, but we know from data in the past year that there's been about a 10-fold increase in the prevalence of autism and about a 40-fold increase in the diagnostic use or diagnostic prevalence for child bipolar illness. And for both of those, we really have, at this point, no medications that have been developed for the core symptoms of these disorders. So this is really not a place, from my perspective, where we need to be celebrating how far we've come. What I would say is that we've learned a lot from these trials. We can actually improve the quality of care, but what has been most striking is that even with optimized care, the outcomes really aren't very good. What we often say now where I work is that we've got treatments that help too few people get better and really very, very few people get well. So we need a whole new generation of treatments to look at this. It's actually not just in terms of, again, morbidity, but mortality. The people with serious mental illness, this is in 2007, are dying on average about 25 years earlier than those without. So this is really, to go back to my very early comments, in some sense, a problem of social justice. You've got a set of disorders here for which we just have yet to develop the kinds of treatments we need. And for those treatments that we haven't been able to get them to the people who most need them, either because there isn't insurance parity or because there isn't the access, or because in many cases in the United States, there isn't the cultural competence, the ability to actually provide the kind of care to people who most need it. So this has led my institute to really take a step back in the past several months and to say, we've got to do something very different. And to do that, we decided to put together a strategic plan. And I've been showing this because if you want to know where we're going to be putting our money, it's going to be around this plan. We're really trying to move our investments to make the biggest difference in these illnesses. We spend about $1 billion a year on research in mental illness. And I need to know that that's money well spent. And so this is the way that we thought we would begin to focus on that. 4 objectives. The first one is to really work out the pathophysiology of all these illnesses, and just the way I talked about, going from genes to cells to circuits to behavior and back again. A lot of this will involve being able to pin down both the genetic and epigenetic basis of each of the major illnesses and begin to understand how they develop across time as developmental brain disorders. The second point is to try to understand these disorders in a much more longitudinal fashion, just the way I mentioned for schizophrenia, but we could do this for every one of them. Now, this is happening in the rest of medicine as well, but it really needs to happen here. We absolutely need to have predictive biomarkers so that we don't wait until the train wreck, we don't wait until the worst consequence to make a diagnosis of bipolar illness or depression or schizophrenia. If we really want to have an impact on morbidity and mortality, we've got to get there earlier, just as we're doing now for coronary artery disease. We don't wait for the MI to make a diagnosis. So this involves a whole new set of new kind of studies. It means doing imaging longitudinally. It means studying children at risk. It means understanding individual patterns of risk rather than population patterns of risk. All the kinds of studies that we've begun to do in the rest of medicine, but need to do here for mental illness. The third piece here is on the intervention side. And here I think we've got to really step back and think very differently about the development of new generations of treatments. They need to be based on pathophysiology and what we're getting out of objectives 1 and 2. We need to be thinking about preemptive interventions. So what would you do? What would be the statin for someone at risk for schizophrenia? It may not be an antipsychotic at all. It may not be a medication. It may be a behavioral or cognitive intervention, perhaps something that's based on the web, that would allow you to take someone at high risk and make sure that they don't actually go through the transition to psychosis. Thinking about how to get away from average medicine. So all of the trials we've got are basically telling us that 31% of people will be 40% better. But what we don't know is who will respond best to CBT, who will respond best to an SSRI, who will respond best to some other treatment in the case of depression or in the case of any of the other major illnesses. We need to change the way we do clinical trials so that we begin to build in that kind of information about individual response and then use that in an exploratory way initially and then in a prospective way to be able to optimize care based on tailoring the needs of each individual. And finally, we would like to measure our success in terms of public health impact. So much of what we've done in my institute is to measure our success by our budget, or by the number of people we're funding, or by the number of people we're funding who become members of the Institute of Medicine or the National Academy. All great things. But that's really not what the American people who pay my salary and the salaries of other people at NIH are looking for. They're looking for results. They're looking for treatments that work for them. They're looking for better access. They're looking for also being involved with helping us in some ways to be able to get the kinds of treatments they need. So we're thinking much more about how can we have the greatest impact, how can we do the most for health disparities, which are in fact increasing and not decreasing in this country. And one of the things that bothers us the most at NIH is when we go and give testimony in front of Congress, and a member of Congress says to us, "Doctor, what I think you're telling me is that you want us to give you more funding so that you can make more expensive, high-tech treatments that will be available to fewer people in my district." Well, think again, because that's not what we're about to do. What they really want, that is members of Congress who provide the appropriation that allows us to support research, is to know that we're developing new treatments and new biomarkers and new diagnostic tests that will make medicine better, cheaper, faster, more accessible to those who need it. And that really requires a little bit of a change of pace in the way we think about the kinds of research that we do. Now, the topic here was on translation, and I want to leave you with the idea that when we think about translation, most of what we have been thinking about is kind of this bench-to-bedside approach. It's what I've been talking about up until now, pathophysiology, the genomics, these developing the biomarkers and the new treatments. There's another sort of what we sometimes call that T1. This would be T2, the going from bench-side to practice, which is what I was just implying in terms of this public health impact, which we don't think enough about, but which is scientifically every bit as challenging and as difficult as trying to define biomarkers for bipolar illness. Understanding how we get real-world relevance, how do we improve adherence, how do we make sure that people have access, how do we make sure that what we know is what we actually do in practice, turns out to be a huge, huge barrier to having NIH research make a difference for the people who need it. And that's why I've sort of focused this idea on going from neurons to neighborhoods, because I think for us, when we think about translation at NIH, we increasingly think about this T2 piece, the bedside to practice, every bit as much as we do the bench to bedside. And we think about this in a reciprocal way. So getting those in neighborhoods to help us think about what is it that they most need? What is the science that will make the biggest difference for them? As well as using that science to make sure that they have access to what they most need. Let me finish with what I think this means in terms of what needs to happen in universities, because I do think this calls for a very different kind of science in the way that we're structured. Certainly it means interdisciplinary, which has kind of been in the buzzword for a decade now, but it means going across the kind of classical disciplines and departments that most universities have. And neuroscience is obviously a prototype for how to do that. And the fact that you can now do this between the medical school and the rest of the university, I think is, neuroscience is maybe an ideal bridge to make that happen. We have a tradition of science which is based on an individual becoming famous for getting information and holding on to it as long as possible, using that in a kind of proprietary, independent fashion. The need increasingly is for teams of people getting together. We don't actually train that much in team science. We need to think about how to do that better. But for both recognizing teamwork as well as for supporting it. In much of science, and I see this still with review committees, one of the most common things I see as I look at the summary statements that come through is people say, this is it's a clearly delineated hypothesis is being tested. Well, sometimes that's really important, but I would submit that right now we don't know enough to raise a hypothesis for many of the things that we are most interested in. So we need a period here of discovery research, and we need to think about the best ways to fund that. And finally, we need to get past the proprietary nature of our science, that it's, if science really is going to have the biggest impact on the public, it needs to also be made as accessible and as available through sharing as quickly as possible. Particularly publicly funded science needs to be publicly available. I'll finish with this one, I'm sure, apocryphal story, but it's one I couldn't resist telling you, that I've heard a couple of times. It's said that when Einstein moved to Princeton and he was teaching, he used to teach a graduate seminar every year. He didn't teach much, and as you can imagine, he wasn't very good at it. But when it was said that he was giving a final exam, someone raised their hand in the back of the room and said, "Excuse me, professor, but these are the same questions you used on last year's exam." And without missing a beat, he said, "Yeah, that's right, but this year the answers are completely different." And that's very much the spirit in which I'd like to leave you. And I think we do have a fantastic opportunity to make really breakthroughs in this field, but it's going to require teamwork. It's going to require this kind of translation across disciplines, across campuses in this case, and being able to be focused very much on what I started with, which is the way in which this information can really change society and make the world we live in a far, far better place. So I think with that, I'll stop and see if we have time for questions. Thank you.
We have time for a few questions. There are microphones coming around, so just wait until the microphone comes to you.
The objectives that the IMH is changing are clear. Are there any changes with regards to like new instructions to the peer review process to work on this? Because, for example, if you go for biological markers or biological studies, if the grant gets to the study section and says, "Oh, there are no preliminary data," we're not gonna, it's no good. Is this anything that's going to be done?
Yeah, absolutely. So we can do this for the review committees that are within our institute, which accounts for about 30% of review. 70% of the review is done through the Center for Scientific Review, CSR. And we have no impact on those committees because they're not reviewing for our institute, they're reviewing for all the institutes. So in that case, what we realized we had to do was something different. So what we've begun to do is to put out special announcements for innovation, for different kinds of research. So the one this last 6 months has been the Eureka Award, which I can't remember what that's an acronym for, but it's looking at research which is essentially completely breakthrough, out-of-the-box research. And we'll be putting about $3 million into those kinds of awards this year. We also have a tradition at my institute for the last 2 years of going way back in the scores, so up into the 30th and 40th percentile, to pull out every round of council grants that we think are truly innovative or that might not have done well in study section because the summary statement says too ambitious. We love too ambitious. If we see a grant that says that, that's one that we are likely to pull out of the pile and try to fund it, particularly if it's from a new investigator. At a much higher score. So we put money aside each time to grab that. But you're right, it's a problem with peer review, which was not set up to identify innovation or breakthrough science. It was set up to weed out science that wasn't good enough quality. But in times of very tight budgets where the pay line starts to go down to 10% or 15%, you have this unintended consequence that all of a sudden it's the sort of safe science that's most likely to make it through. And we recognize that, so we're trying to put in a bunch of ways of kind of working around that dilemma until the budget eases up a bit. So I'm going to, go ahead, Mark. Yeah, I think they want you to use a microphone, though.
In the zeitgeist of neuroscience, I'm I'm just curious, your comment about the following. I think I've heard the director of the Eye Institute bemoan the fact that the institute is called the Eye Institute, and since people don't appreciate the fact that the eye is part of the brain, he was considering changing the name to the Eye and Vision Institute. If you had your druthers, would you consider modifying the National Institute of Mental Health, given your concern about people's awareness of brain and mental status?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. Originally, I threatened to do that. I said if I could, because the Institute had been so focused on work that was not even marginally relevant to mental illness, that I thought we needed to change the name to the National Institute of Mental Disorders, NIMD, but decided that I didn't want to go that direction because there was such a tradition at NIMH that we would try to do this without having a name change. What would be really interesting is to try to work in a more neuroscience-y name, but I'm not sure how to do that. If you have any ideas, we could have a contest maybe and give away an R01 grant to anybody who comes up with the right name.
It would be ambitious.
That would be ambitious, yeah, absolutely.
The second part was simply about evidence-based interventions and outcomes. Whether or not the NIMH is really poised to influence at the mental health delivery level, really issues about evidence-based outcomes that, what do we do in medical school now? What do we do for training a psychologist? Are you really at a point where one can now point to specific things that might bear more fruit in terms of positive outcome?
So you mean in terms of treatments that actually work? And
Well, outcome measures that are perhaps better than those used by the FDA.
Yeah, so absolutely. I mean, there's a lot of interest now in trying to develop outcome measures for function, particularly in the psychotic illnesses, and moving from just changes in rating scales to looking at performance. So if what you really want is for people to recover, then the outcome of interest would have something to do like being able to work. And you can actually, by targeting that, make it more likely it will happen. So we have a big effort underway. Actually, it's a public-private partnership with about 8 pharmaceutical companies who have joined us in this to come up with what we're calling these co-primary measures or functional measures for response. And the FDA has joined the effort as well and has agreed that if we can come up with consensus measures for function, they will accept them as indications for medication development. Yes? I think they want you to use the microphone since this is being recorded. Go ahead.
The majority of pharmaceutical companies have dropped their platforms in terms of depression and schizophrenia, and they really are all concentrating on Alzheimer's disease. What do you think might be the interface to take the new discoveries coming through your initiatives and getting large pharmaceutical companies who have the muscle to really put those forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's clear that the tradition has always been that NIH research, it does more target identification, target validation, and then industry comes in to do the development of small molecules, medicinal chemistry, optimization, and the development of new drugs. We are probably never going to do drug development. But what we can do is to begin to provide them new molecular targets. I would love to have a molecular target for autism, because there's not an autism program for drug development anywhere in the United States.
Say you have it. Pharmaceutical companies are really only focusing their activities on Alzheimer's disease.
Well, so I've been in these conversations recently with various companies that they focus on Alzheimer's disease now because that's where the targets are. They know what to do there. In the case of depression or schizophrenia, the best they can do, they think, is the Me Too compounds. So we've got, 7 antipsychotic drugs in the second generation, and I don't even know how many SSRIs. So you could make another one, and you could give it you could make it a different color, a different name, and you could probably change the dosing schedule, and maybe it'll have a slightly different side effect profile. But there's no evidence that other than marketing it better, you're going to have any greater efficacy with any of these new compounds that are just Me Too compounds. They just don't have an idea about where the better targets are. The one exception is this new antipsychotic drug that's been developed by the Eli Lilly company, which they've only had one report on, that is a mGluR23 agonist. That's pretty interesting because if that in fact works, it opens up that whole avenue as a new area for drug development. But that would be great because we have not had anything quite like that. Karen?
Transdisciplinary research is good for universities. But what kind of things have you done at the NIH with respect to collaborations with National Institutes of Neurological Disease and Stroke, NIBIB, other ICs?
Yeah. So it's a good question about how to, here we are asking everybody to work together. Why don't we do this? After we've got 27 institutes and centers, talk about balkanization of science. Well, actually, that has begun to change. The roadmap was one way of getting everybody on the same page. But there's a more local example, which I think has really been tremendously successful, which is the neuroscience blueprint. We affectionately call that our kind of brain roadmap. And it's not exactly the same as the roadmap. It's a lot smaller, for one thing. But it has been an opportunity for several of these brain institutes, neurology, the Eye Institute, certainly mental health, drug abuse, NIAAA, to come to the table and literally, and we all the directors meet every month, and we all look forward to it. It's a great time to sit down together and say, what can we do collaboratively by pooling just a little bit of our funds and then making something happen that hadn't happened before. We initially, when we started doing this, we weren't sure the best way to go about it. So we decided that we'd have a theme. So for 2006, the theme was neurodegeneration, and for 2007, it was neurodevelopment, and for 2008, it's neuroplasticity. And we have not quite figured out what we're going to do in 2009. But each of those themes has a whole series of RFAs built around it. A whole bunch of interesting projects have spun off. They tend not to be disease-focused. They tend to be more the development of infrastructure, sometimes databases, a whole range of things like core labs for microarrays, or an effort to, now we've just funded to develop a huge panel of new antibodies for genes that are important, proteins that are important for neural development that everybody needs. And it's been a great opportunity for this kind of crosstalk across institutes and for us to really push the field forward. Helen?
I want to go back to the second issue that you had raised about mental disorders being developmental disorders, and that we can identify these cumulative risk markers, if you will, the prodromal state. What are your thoughts, though, about the ethics of treatment or intervention at that stage? As you know, we're not at the point, and it's not clear when we'd be at the point where even if we'd have a pretty high risk marker, we would be able to know the outcome. Or even if we did, we know that in every one of these mental diseases, as opposed to heart disease, there's what I'll call the resistance movement, the political wing of the party that resists any form of treatment and says, I like my schizophrenia or I like my autism. How do you think we're going to handle that from an ethical perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. And the way I think about it is that we have to get away from assuming that the kinds of interventions that we offer people at risk, that they would look anything like the interventions we use after someone has had a psychotic episode. So the assumption has been, for instance, that you'd use low doses of an antipsychotic to preempt the psychosis of schizophrenia. We have no idea whether that would be useful. And certainly, you'd want to be very certain that someone was in the high risk group before you started doing that, because if you were wrong 10% of the time, you'd be treating an awful lot of people and putting them at risk for adverse events that for completely useless reasons. So I think it is a problem. Where I'm more hopeful is that, at least for schizophrenia, if we define this as a disorder that mostly has to do with errant cognition, with cognitive deficits, that now we are really beginning to identify. And let's say those deficits are largely in something like working memory and attentional tasks. You could imagine developing interventions that would look much more like what you do for cognitive remediation, for children with dyslexia, for sort of school-based interventions that never have to be tagged to schizophrenia whatsoever. What you would do is you'd sort of, you could imagine a time, a decade from now, when you would begin to define a whole profile of cognitive problems, of which one very unfortunate and perhaps extreme consequence would be psychosis. But all these other people would be at risk for just not doing well on their college board exams or something like that. And so the intervention can be much more of a kind of educational and preemptive intervention in that sense.
But what about the creativity that you'd be removing, potentially?
Yeah.
By training, by increasing working memory and attention?
It's been so interesting that there's this assumption that, and the public really buys into this, that somehow mental illness is good for creativity. And the data simply aren't there. They really aren't. If you look at people who have had depression is the example that's usually used. So you talk about someone like Bill Styron, so a wonderful writer who went through a terrible time with major depressive disorder. And if you really push him and say, but wasn't that essential for you to be able to write Sophie's Choice or to write some of these great novels? He would say, my depression kept me from being creative. It was my depression that actually precluded my being able to produce and be able to be effective. And he would trade that in instantaneously for a life without it. So I don't think we're talking about removing human suffering by any means, but we're talking about reducing human suffering based on having one of these illnesses, in the same way that we would talk about reducing human suffering based on cancer or heart disease. It doesn't make people necessarily have a life that's free of all kinds of other complications and difficulties, but it's hard enough to be able to get through life without having to carry this additional burden of not being able to control your thoughts because you've got an additional voice in your head all the time, or not being able to sleep for days at a time, or not being able to actually have any ability to focus your attention. So that's really what we're talking about, is getting people to be able to function well enough so at least they can have the human suffering and use it to be creative. But you're right, there is certainly, as soon as you talk about trying to move earlier and to intervene earlier, you get into the territory that the anti-psychiatry movement has occupied so effectively. And the only way, I think, again, as I said at the very beginning, the only way to counter that is with great science. You need the data, and you need to hear from people for whom this science has made a difference. There's one question in the back. Are we okay on time? Okay. Last question then. Yeah.
You made a couple of statements about the public having a different perspective on mental health disorders, and I was wondering if you think that an objective of the National Institute of Mental Health should be public education.
Yes. So I think, actually, I would say it's an objective for all of us that we do research with public funds. And we deserve to let the public know what we've done with their money. So I would hope that everybody who has support from NIH would think about spending some of their time by working in a junior high school, talking to the public, in the case of neuroscientists, using Brain Awareness Week as a chance to do outreach, or even making sure that friends and family know about the importance of using animals in research, about the importance of understanding more about the brain so we can have an impact on these illnesses, and the value of research for making society a better place. Otherwise, we're going to lose public support. And you think it's bad now. You wait until budgets actually start to be cut rather than just being held flat. You had another question? No?
Well, I mean, you just mentioned a few ways that we as a general community could help
Right.
the public understand, but I was wondering if you had any ideas of specific programs that the NIMH could implement.
Well, we do a lot of publication, and we do a lot of everything from videos and things like that. But I think for people here, I'll put in a plug for Brain Awareness Week, or now it's becoming Brain Awareness Month, which is supported mostly by the Dana Foundation, not by NIH. But it's a chance every March to do a very active outreach to help the community understand what's going on in terms of brain science. Kids love this stuff. They really do. I mean, it's something that deals with behavior, and that's something that's much easier to interest high school students in. Sex and drugs is really, that's part of neuroscience. Much easier to sell that than cancer or heart disease to a group of high school students. So we have a great opportunity. We just haven't exploited it fully. And I'm telling you, we really need to, because we do research only because the public is willing to support it. And they only will be willing to support it if they understand what comes out of that huge public investment. And with that, I thank you for your attention.